It was supposed to be the perfect day. The ballroom at the Grand Rosewood Hotel had been transformed into a vision of luxury. White roses lined the aisles, crystal chandeliers glittered above, and the grand wedding cake stood proudly at the center, an edible masterpiece for a day that was meant to mark the beginning of a beautiful life. But it wasn't perfect, not even close. Julian Hartwell, dressed in a perfectly tailored Armani tuxedo, sat in the dimly lit alley behind the hotel, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His eyes were red, his face streaked with the remnants of tears he couldn't stop shedding. The sounds of the wedding, the laughter, the music, the joy seemed a million miles away as he stared down at his phone. 30 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, Veronica Ashford, the woman he'd planned to marry for the last 3 years, had sent him a text. "I can't do this. I'm sorry. Don't try to find me." No explanation, no phone call, just those 12 words that shattered him. The sound of Julian's sobs echoed in the alley, raw and desperate, but no one was there to hear. The guests had been sent home. The grand reception hall lay empty, and Julian, he was left behind in the mess of what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. How does this feel as an opening? Let me know and I'll proceed with the next part. Delilah Monroe had been walking the streets of downtown for hours, the weight of her worn backpack pulling at her shoulders. At 24, she had learned that life rarely went according to plan. Just the day before, she had packed her few belongings, leaving behind an apartment she couldn't afford with only a few coins to her name. A friend had let her stay the night on the couch, but that generosity had an expiration date. Today, she found herself without a place to stay, walking aimlessly toward the women's shelter on 5th Street, where she hoped to find some stability, at least for one more night. But the city, with its gleaming buildings and bustling streets, seemed so far removed from the struggle she faced. As she walked, her mind raced with thoughts of how things had gone wrong. Her life wasn't meant to be this way, but even as uncertainty clouded her path, Delilah kept going. She had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting. It was in her nature, after all, to survive, and to help others, no matter how tough life got for her. When she heard the sobs, something inside her shifted. It was raw, desperate. The sound pulled at her like a thread unraveling, drawing her in. She paused at the entrance to an alleyway where the noise grew louder. It wasn't like anything else she'd heard in this part of the city. The streets were quiet, but this cry, it was urgent, a human cry of pain, a cry she recognized all too well. Delilah could have kept walking. She had no time to spare, after all, but something told her to stop. Maybe it was her own loneliness. Or perhaps it was because she knew that sometimes in life, reaching out to another person was all you could do to make a difference. So she took a deep breath and walked into the alley. She spotted him almost immediately. A man in a tuxedo, crumpled against the brick wall, his hands buried in his face, his body trembling with grief. The wedding flowers on his lapel were still intact, untouched, a stark contrast to the mess of emotions he was displaying. Delilah's first instinct was to turn away, to keep walking toward the shelter. After all, what could she do for someone like him? A man in a designer suit was far from her world. But something inside her clicked. She couldn't leave him like this. Without saying a word, she walked over, knelt down beside him, and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pulling him into an embrace. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a pity move. She simply held him because, in that moment, it was what he needed. For a moment, Julian tensed, startled by her sudden presence. He looked up, confusion flashing in his eyes, but Delilah didn't pull away. She didn't ask him why he was there or what had happened. She just sat with him quietly, letting her presence offer the comfort he couldn't ask for. Julian's sobs grew quieter, his body slowly relaxing against hers. The strange, unexpected bond they formed in silence was like a balm for his wounded soul. Delilah wasn't someone who saw him as a wealthy heir or a public figure. She didn't know who he was, and that made all the difference. In her embrace, he was a man left at the altar in front of hundreds of people. He was simply a man in pain, someone deserving of compassion. Her touch didn't feel like charity, it felt like a lifeline. The mix of emotions that ran through Julian in that moment was overwhelming. He felt confused. Why was this stranger, someone who had no obligation to him, taking the time to comfort him? Why was she here with him in this alley, offering him the kind of solace no one had been able to? There was vulnerability in the way he let himself lean into her embrace, and it made him feel exposed, raw, and, strangely, grateful. For the first time since Veronica's text shattered his world, Julian didn't feel like the rich, well-connected heir of the Hartwell family. He didn't feel like the groom humiliated before his guests. He didn't feel like the failure everyone assumed him to be. He was simply a man who had been left alone at a pivotal moment in his life, and this stranger, this woman, had chosen to sit beside him to share his grief. He pulled back slightly, wiping his face, embarrassed by the tears that still lingered. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't need to." Delilah didn't let him finish. "Everyone needs someone sometimes," she said, her voice steady and kind. There was no pity in her words, just a simple, profound truth. In that instant, Julian realized how much he had needed someone like her. Someone who wasn't afraid to face the raw truth of life. Someone who understood that even the richest man could feel lost, even the strongest could need a helping hand. And as they sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, Julian couldn't help but wonder, how had a chance encounter with a stranger in an alley led him to this unexpected comfort? And how had this one moment of compassion shifted everything for him? Julian Hartwell's life had always been marked by privilege. From the moment he was born, his future had been set. He was heir to the Hartwell real estate empire, a figure whose name commanded respect in the highest circles. His life was one of luxury, fancy cars, five-star hotels, invitations to the most exclusive events. He had everything he could ever want, except for the one thing that mattered most: genuine connection. But Delilah Monroe's world couldn't have been more different. She had grown up in foster care, bounced from one home to the next, with little more than the clothes on her back and the determination to make something of herself. Every day had been a struggle, finding a place to sleep, scraping together enough money to eat, working multiple jobs just to get by. Life hadn't given her any guarantees, but it had given her something far more valuable: resilience. When Julian and Delilah first met, the differences between them were immediately apparent. He was dressed in a fine tuxedo, the kind of suit that cost more than Delilah's entire wardrobe. His speech was polished, his demeanor refined. She, on the other hand, had the worn look of someone who had walked miles in shoes that didn't quite fit. Her jeans were faded, and her hair was pulled into a practical ponytail. Her backpack, small but heavy with the weight of her belongings, had seen better days. But it was in their conversations that the real contrast emerged. Julian spoke in careful sentences, every word weighed and considered. Delilah, on the other hand, was brutally honest, often speaking before she had time to think. There was no pretension in her voice, no need to hide behind wealth or status. She didn't care who he was or how much money he had. She saw him for who he truly was, the man sitting in an alley, broken and vulnerable. At first, Julian had been unsure of what to make of Delilah. Her bluntness was a shock to his system. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't apologize for her circumstances. She didn't offer false reassurances. And yet, her honesty was a breath of fresh air. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he was talking to someone who didn't want anything from him. As the days turned into weeks, Julian found himself returning to Delilah's presence time and again. Each time she offered him something he didn't know he needed: perspective. Where others might have coddled him, tried to fix him, Delilah let him be. She never pretended that life was easy, nor did she suggest that he should move on from Veronica's betrayal. Instead, she simply listened. No judgment, no pity, just understanding. One night as they sat in a small cafe, Julian opened up about the life he had built with Veronica, the plans, the house, the family they were supposed to have. He spoke with a rawness he hadn't known he was capable of. Delilah didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice or tell him he'd be fine. She simply said, "You built a life with someone who was never going to show up for you. You're lucky she left now." Her words hit him harder than he expected. In her unflinching honesty, Delilah had made him see something he had refused to acknowledge for years. His relationship with Veronica had been based on an illusion. He had fallen in love with the idea of a perfect life, not the reality of who Veronica truly was. "That doesn't mean you're not worthy of love," Delilah continued. "It just means you weren't getting it from the right place." For the first time, Julian began to question everything he had ever thought he knew about love, about relationships, and about his own worth. He wasn't defined by his wealth or his status. He wasn't defined by Veronica's rejection. He was more than that. The more time Julian spent with Delilah, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had been living in a world where everything was handed to him on a silver platter, where success was expected and failure was a foreign concept. Delilah, however, had built her life piece by piece, never asking for anyone's help, always making do with what she had. And it wasn't just her resilience that moved him, it was her compassion. Even though she had nothing, she was always willing to give. She didn't see him as a wealthy heir or a man who had it all. She saw him as someone who needed help, just like anyone else. It was this same compassion that Julian had felt during that first moment in the alley. Delilah didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess herself. She simply offered him what he needed most: human connection. It was time for Julian to give something back. He didn't want to help Delilah out of charity. He wanted to offer her something she deserved, not because she had helped him, but because she had shown him what real kindness looked like. He found her a small studio apartment, connected her with a job in social services, and helped her get back on her feet, not as a favor, but as a way of showing gratitude for the compassion she had shown him. Through Delilah, Julian began to see the world differently. He realized that his wealth didn't define his worth. His success wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about the relationships he built, the people he loved, and the compassion he was willing to offer to others. It had been 8 months since Veronica Ashford had left Julian at the altar. 8 months of silence, where Julian had finally begun to heal, to rebuild his life, and to embrace a future that didn't revolve around the woman who had once promised him everything. He had found comfort in Delilah's honesty, in the simple truth of a connection that wasn't defined by wealth or social status. But just when he thought he had moved on, Veronica reappeared. The text was simple: "I made a mistake, can we talk?" At first, Julian wasn't sure how to react. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time Veronica had tried to re-enter his life. After all, she had left him once before with no explanation. Why would this time be different? He tried to ignore the message, but it wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him, the temptation to understand why she had left, the desire to gain closure. After months of living without her, Julian found himself torn between the past he thought he had put behind him and the future he had started to build with Delilah. Should he entertain the woman who had so thoroughly shattered him? Or had he finally gained the strength to say goodbye to the past once and for all? Delilah didn't show surprise when Julian told her about the text. She didn't ask him what he planned to do, didn't try to sway his decision. She simply listened, her expression neutral, her eyes full of understanding. "You should meet her," Delilah said quietly, as they sat in the small apartment she had worked so hard to rebuild. "You need to get your answers, even if it's just for closure." Julian hesitated. He wasn't used to hearing such practical advice, especially not from someone who had already seen so much of life's hardships. But Delilah's calmness reassured him. She wasn't threatened by Veronica's reappearance. There was no jealousy, no bitterness. She wasn't clinging to him or pushing him to make a decision that would benefit her. She was allowing him the space to navigate this on his own. "You don't mind?" Julian asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. Delilah met his gaze, her voice steady. "No, I'm not here to control your decisions. I'm here because you're someone who values honesty and understanding, and I trust you. If you need to meet her, then do it. But I want you to remember that it's about you finding peace, not her, not what she wants." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Delilah was giving him the freedom to choose, without making him feel guilty or conflicted. She had her own life, her own goals, and she wasn't about to become a pawn in a game that Veronica had already played with him. Her ability to stay firm in her own identity, while still supporting his journey, made Julian realize just how much he had learned from her, how his own emotions and decisions didn't have to be tied to anyone else's expectations. The night of the meeting, Julian found himself standing at the entrance of an upscale restaurant, the place where he and Veronica had celebrated countless anniversaries and milestones. He hadn't been back since the day she left him. He stepped inside looking for her, and there she was, Veronica, sitting at a table by the window, perfectly composed as if nothing had ever happened between them. Her hair was immaculate, her smile flawless, and she wore a coat that Julian remembered seeing on her during their early days together. For a moment Julian stood frozen, the old feelings rushing back, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. He took a deep breath and walked toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Julian, it's so good to see you," Veronica said with a smile that, to him, now felt rehearsed. She reached out for his hand, but Julian pulled it back before it could touch hers. "Why now?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. "After all this time, why come back now?" Veronica's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "I've missed you," she said softly. "I know I made a mistake. I left and I didn't explain myself. But I've had time to think and I realize I made a huge mistake. I want us to have a second chance." The words hung in the air, heavy with the past. Julian wanted to believe her. He wanted to hear that she had changed, that she was different. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. His perspective had shifted. The love he had once felt for Veronica now seemed more like a memory of who he thought she was, not who she really was. He looked at her, his heart still aching but no longer broken. "I'm seeing someone, Veronica, and it's not just someone. Her name is Delilah. We've been together for a while now." Veronica's eyes narrowed for a brief moment before the mask of politeness returned. "Really?" she asked, the tone in her voice sharp. "How serious can it be after 3 months?" "It's not about the time," Julian replied. "It's about the connection. Delilah is real. She doesn't need anything from me. She doesn't need my money or my status." Veronica's smile turned to a smirk. "I don't understand, Julian. You've spent your life with people who want what you have, and now you're with her, someone who has nothing." Julian's patience wore thin. He leaned forward, his voice cold. Don't talk about her that way. You don't get to do that." As the conversation progressed, Julian could feel the tension rising. Every word Veronica spoke felt like an attack, an attempt to reel him back in. But Julian was no longer the man who had stood at the altar, unsure of himself. He had learned the hard way that not everyone deserved a place in his life. With a final glance at Veronica, he stood up, his voice unwavering. "I'm done here. Don't contact me again." As he walked out of the restaurant, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The past no longer had a hold on him. He had moved forward toward Delilah, toward a future where he could finally breathe without the weight of Veronica's manipulation holding him back. If you've ever been caught in a tug-of-war between the past and the future, share this video with someone who might relate. Let them know that sometimes the kindness of a stranger can change everything, and that true connection is about embracing the present, not holding on to what's already gone. Julian couldn't stop replaying the words Veronica had said at the restaurant. "You've spent your life with people who want what you have." They echoed in his mind, an accusation disguised as concern. It was the same argument she'd used all those years ago when he'd asked for something more than a picture-perfect image. She had never been interested in what he truly needed, only what he could give her. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, the weight of the decision still hung heavy. He knew Veronica's return had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. But as the door clicked shut behind him, he realized something. He had already made his choice. It was Veronica's love he needed. It wasn't her apology or the sense of closure that still lingered in the air. What he needed, what he had been missing all along, was authenticity, a connection that wasn't rooted in appearances or expectations. It was the quiet strength that Delilah had shown him from the very beginning. Her honesty, her resilience, her capacity to offer comfort without asking for anything in return. This was the love he had been searching for, even if he hadn't known it. When Julian thought of Delilah now, he didn't see the homeless woman he had first met in that alley. He saw someone who had faced unimaginable hardship and still chose kindness, someone who wasn't looking to be saved but who simply wanted to help others. And he realized that it wasn't just Delilah's compassion that drew him in. It was her humanity, her refusal to let life's hardships strip her of the ability to care for others. She had saved him, in a way Veronica never could. Julian made the decision then and there, as he stood in the quiet of his apartment, to move forward, not with Veronica, but with Delilah. He would no longer be the man who let the past define him. He would be the man who chose his own path. The next morning, Julian found himself packing in the living room, his mind racing with everything he needed to say. The night before, he had made the decision to move on, but he knew that he couldn't carry on without speaking to Delilah. She deserved to know the truth, the full truth about how much she had changed him. When she arrived at his place, her usual calm demeanor greeted him, but there was something different in the air between them now. Julian had never been one to wear his heart on his sleeve, but with Delilah, it felt different. He wanted her to understand the weight of everything he had just gone through and what it had led him to. A choice. "I met with Veronica last night," Julian began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She came back, told me she made a mistake, that she wanted a second chance. I thought I could give her that, but then I realized something. The past isn't what I want anymore. What I want, what I need, is right here." He paused, taking a breath. Delilah's expression remained neutral, but there was a softness in her eyes that made his heart beat a little faster. "I'm not the same person I was before. I don't need Veronica's approval or anyone's to know who I am. I've learned that from you. You've shown me what real love is. It's not about money or status or perfect images. It's about understanding. It's about being true to yourself. And I want that with you, Delilah. I want to build something real, something that's ours." Delilah didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a step closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm glad you're saying that," she said quietly. "Because you don't need Veronica. You never did. But you need to realize that you're enough just the way you are. You don't need to be anyone else, and you definitely don't need to be the man she wanted you to be. You're more than that." Her words were like a light in the darkness, a reminder of everything he had been blind to before. Delilah wasn't just a person he had found comfort in. She was his mirror, reflecting back at him the strength he had forgotten he had. In her, Julian found a love that was free of conditions, free of expectation. She had shown him that he could be loved for exactly who he was, not for the title he carried or the life others expected him to live. As the weeks went by, Julian's transformation became more evident, not just to himself but to those around him. His relationship with Delilah deepened in ways he hadn't expected. They didn't have grand gestures or expensive dinners, but they shared something far more valuable, a foundation of trust, honesty, and mutual respect. Delilah never asked him to be anyone he was. She didn't need the billionaire Julian to validate her own existence. What she needed, and what she had always needed, was someone who saw her for who she truly was. Julian had learned that lesson the hard way. He had spent so many years chasing approval, whether it was from his family, his friends, or Veronica. But in Delilah, he had found someone who simply wanted him to be real. Their love was simple, but it was also powerful. It was built on the truth of who they were, not who they were supposed to be. And it wasn't just Julian who had changed, it was Delilah too. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, and instead of running, she had stayed. She had shown him that love didn't have to be earned through status or wealth. It was earned through kindness, empathy, and authenticity. When Julian looked at Delilah now, he didn't see the woman who had once been homeless, struggling to make ends meet. He saw someone who had been through more than he could imagine, and yet still chose to offer compassion when it mattered most. She had taught him that the best things in life couldn't be bought or planned. They just happened. It had been a year since Julian had first sat in that alley, broken and defeated, unsure of what life held for him. He had come so far since then, no longer the man crushed by public humiliation or the disappointment of losing Veronica. He was a man who had learned to embrace authenticity, to appreciate the quiet strength that Delilah had taught him, and to understand that real love doesn't come with conditions or expectations. That evening, as the sun began to set and the city's bustling noise softened into the cool of the night, Julian found himself standing at the very spot where it all began, by the alley behind the Grand Rosewood Hotel. This time, he wasn't sitting there in despair. He stood tall, his heart calm and certain. The world around him had changed, and so had he. Delilah stood beside him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. She had always been there for him, through his pain, his growth, and everything in between. And now, standing here, Julian knew that this was where his new life had truly begun. It wasn't in the boardrooms he had inherited or the mansions he had once thought would bring him happiness. It was here in this simple, unremarkable alley where everything had shifted for the better. He turned to Delilah, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "This is where my life changed, where I met you, where you showed me what kindness really is." Delilah smiled softly, her gaze steady and warm. "You changed yourself, Julian. I was just there to remind you." But Julian knew it wasn't just about the moments they had shared. It was about the lessons she had taught him. To stop seeking validation from a world that only cared about appearances, to stop living a life built on expectations, and to start living for himself, for them. "Delilah," he said, taking her hand and leading her closer to where they had first met. "You've made me a better man, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." He got down on one knee, his heart racing, not from fear but from the overwhelming certainty that this was the right thing to do. The world around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them in that quiet moment of promise. "Will you marry me, Delilah Monroe? Will you be the one who helps me continue this journey of growth, of love, and of being who I was meant to be?" Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. "Yes, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Julian stood up, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly as if to never let go of the woman who had changed everything. In that moment, he realized that love wasn't just about the grand gestures, the wedding plans, or the material things that once consumed him. It was about the moments of connection, of understanding, and of building something real with someone who accepted him for who he truly was. Their journey wasn't about perfection. It was about the imperfect moments they had shared, the alley, the quiet understanding, the compassion, and how those moments had led them to this one. It was a love born from struggle, but one that had blossomed into something beautiful and unshakable. Julian and Delilah's story is a reminder that even the darkest moments can lead to a brighter future. Life doesn't always go as planned, but sometimes the unexpected turns are the ones that bring us closer to what we need. Have you ever faced a challenge that changed your life? What would you do if the world seemed to collapse around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the power of kindness and second chances. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories of transformation and hope.